Welcome. This is Joe Hoolahan, CEO of JESI Management Source. Thank you for all joining us on our Grey Fleet webinar. We was just saying before, we've actually been inundated with responses. We're very fortunate to have people calling in from all over the globe to listen to our special guest, Paul Jorgensen. Paul, are you there?
Yes, good morning, Joe.
Good morning. Good morning. It is 8 o'clock in the UK. It's 7 o'clock in Sydney, Melbourne, and Eastern States. At Queensland, we have 6 o'clock. So we're testing the realms of technology, but certainly we welcome everybody into the conference. And as a way of introduction, I'd like to just introduce Paul Jorgensen, Senior Partner of Strategic Analytics, years in logistics and HSE operations experience gained across Europe, Middle East with Shell, Occidental Petroleum, DHL, Excel, and these have been often in challenging and remote locations, including a 4-year period in Iraq. Paul has a clear and deep understanding of complex business issues. He combines this with an understanding of working in multicultural teams to get the very best from them to deliver the high standards that he personally sets. With a focus on lean practitioner methodology, enabling organisations to focus continually on improvement, combined with a strong ability to help design, deliver, implement, and embed new technical and process solutions to clients, allows Paul to assist clients with multiple areas of their logistics operations and HSSE. Paul is identified as subject matter expert in safety journey management systems for land transport operations and closely works with clients on the design and implementation of innovation logistics management systems. And he has a very kind mother who writes all that for him. So, Paul, welcome.
Thank you, Joe. That's very kind of you. It's quite exciting. We have as you know, the new partnership between JESI and Strategic Analytics team. And I'm quite looking forward to building on that as we go forward into the future. One of the comments that you made earlier about having all of these people in from all over the world reminded me that when I was a kid in school, more years ago than I probably want to remember, we used to have a computer laboratory there. I was never allowed into it on the grounds I wasn't smart enough, apparently, because I was too busy dreaming about things like James T. Kirk and his communicator talking to the rest of the world and the universe. And here we are, having gone through a communications revolution and a technology revolution that now allows us to talk to all of our guests today and welcome them into this conference. And I think it's really kind of useful for us to be able to do that on more than one level, because it saves us so many things. So, for example, all of that things in the past where you and I would have had to get on planes and travel to places and all the rest of it, and now we can kind of sit at our desks and talk to everybody and show and explain to people what it is that we can do for them and the capabilities around the systems that we have. So, really exciting stuff.
It's very true. The enabling aspect of technology, we're certainly very grateful for it. But the enabling technology, I did also hear a rumour that Strategic Analytics team have once again been nominated for another award over in UK. You guys are cleaning up the awards.
Yeah, we are a little bit, actually, Joe. Yeah. So the last award that we've been nominated for was the Greater Manchester Business Award, and we've just been nominated as a finalist, I believe, for the Northwest Business Masters Awards, which covers all businesses across the northwest of the UK. So that one was announced at the end of last week. So I'm really pleased about that.
Congratulations. It's obviously all that's happening since you've become a part of JESI, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
I would like to take some credit, but obviously we're very happy to be working with yourself and your dedicated team. Look, I think, Paul, without spending too much time us talking, we could talk about cricket and all sorts of things this morning, this afternoon. But we're obviously here to talk about defining grey fleets. Now, jumping straight into it, for our Australian listeners, grey fleets is a relatively new term.
Mm-hmm.
Paul, I guess, love to hear from a European context, what are you seeing at the moment that defines this topic of grey fleets?
Right. So, grey fleet essentially, when it's referred to, is any vehicle that is not owned by the company or an employer, but is used for business purposes. So just to put that into context for people, that could be your one of your employees who you ask to go and do drop some mail off for you on the way home. When they use their personal car to do that, that now becomes part of your grey fleet. Just to put that into context for you, in the UK there are an estimated 14 million grey fleet vehicles on the road. And at the end of September 2016, there were only 37.4 million vehicles registered on roads in the UK. So they account for almost 50% of all traffic on the roads. And they cover then all types of companies and organisations, from SMEs, small to medium-sized enterprises, to major corporations and government bodies. And so the message to employers really is that it doesn't matter who owns the car. If it's being used on company business, then they can be held liable if an incident occurs. And to give you an example, or to put some more strength to that, if you pay a car allowance, if you pay for fuel to go into the vehicle, pay a mileage allowance, amongst many other things, then you as an employer could now be held responsible for both the employee driving it, the vehicle, and any incident that may occur, even if that happens to be a third party hitting your vehicle or your employee's vehicle.
That's quite an astonishing fact, isn't it, when you start to think about the knock-on effects of that when you're talking just in the UK alone. 14 million vehicles, you said, are classified as grey fleets. That's quite a large number. That's going to touch a lot of businesses and a lot of people.
Significantly. And the way that legal action moves across kind of like America and then Europe and other places, it becomes more and more relevant to employers. It's kind of always been there, just maybe not very well defined and enforced. And I think those days change. Yeah.
I'm just mindful that we're getting a few more people join in. Welcome to those that are joining late. So we have kicked off with Paul Jorgensen, Senior Partner of Strategic Analytics Team, and just saw one message come through that there may have been a problem with the sound at the start, but we'll just keep powering through. If anyone does have an issue, please feel free to type through a message, and we'll keep it as we go. It is recording as well, so if you do miss it, we'll be able to record it and put it online after the event. So, Paul, getting into the discussion, Australian businesses are now starting to pay some attention to grey fleets as they're becoming more aware of it. I'm not talking about the large corporations, but any size business that, like you just mentioned, probably, are there any key industries that seem to be leading the way in regards to identifying these grey fleets?
Sorry, Joe, can you just repeat the last bit of that question?
Yeah, just probably are there obvious businesses or industries that are more likely to be, I guess, leading the way, or the ones that are actually harnessing the risks and the exposure around the grey fleets?
No, there aren't actually, because as we just discussed, almost 50% of cars on the road in the UK are potentially that grey fleet area, and so the types of businesses that will be affected by it could be anywhere. So, for example, my wife is a gas engineer and plumber. Her van is effectively grey fleet. So you've got plumbers, electricians. You could have people who own flower shops or news agents, or all types of businesses. Yeah, and it can go across all of those into things like service industries. So you can have carers, nurses, health workers, government workers, can all be part of that grey fleet kind of thing. Yeah, and it doesn't matter to a large degree with the types of industries or businesses that people are involved in. I think what's important is that it's around the employer's duty of care and their compliance and the checks and balances that they need to go through to ensure that their employees are looked after and that they as an employer are protected against claims that may be made against them. And that's kind of where we want to focus. So, for example, this is one of the reasons that we liked JESI products, because it leads us into that position of being able to look after that duty of care element and the compliance elements that we need to go through.
That's a great plug for JESI, Paul. We appreciate that. But it really is alarming when you do, as you mentioned it, it's the person that might be using the car to run an errand on the way home, but all good willing, but unfortunately, if there is an incident, that's going to certainly be a question that's now raised. I was only thinking this morning before our chat that we think how many people are probably even in the position where they're driving to an after-hours function that is a work function, and obviously the additional risk there at night and perhaps maybe after a few corporate drinks, etc. It really does bring into quite an alarming aspect, doesn't it?
It does actually, and just to kind of like make it even more alarming, there are some shocking statistics. Yeah, and we're showing here when saying 59% of work-related fatalities involved in a vehicle.
Yeah.
In 2015. Yeah. So I haven't been able to check out the standards in Australia because, as you know, I've been away the last couple of days, but. I do know that there are different standards in, for example, obtaining driving licenses. So in Tasmania, there's a lower requirement for basic learner driver than, say, Queensland or Western Australia. Yeah. But here's a shocking one for you. So a newspaper article the other day in the UK congratulated a 17-year-old because they'd passed their driving test the first time, having had 6 hours of driver training. Now, he's now legally entitled to drive a Ferrari if he could get insurance for it. Yeah. And that
6 hours. Wow.
6 hours. Yeah, absolutely. Now, depending on where you are in the world, there are different bits of legislation in. So if you're in Norway, for example, there would be very strict limitations on the type of vehicle that you can drive. There are limitations, I'm glad to say, on the types of vehicles that you can drive in the UK. So you can't go out and drive, for example, a 3.5-ton truck, or a 7.5-ton truck, or a 40-ton truck.
So Paul, talking about the statistics there, so when we talk about, here in Australia, for the Australian listeners, we're talking about, currently work-related road crashes account for 1 in 3 occupational fatalities. So, every time we have a fatality, one of those is actually 1 in 3 is due to an incident involving a road crash. Second one we have is, we talked about the one on the screen, 59% of work-related fatalities involve a vehicle. I mean, they're stats that are right in our backyard. And what does amaze me is we still drive massive distances in Australia, and we probably are expecting people to drive home from those massive distances as well. So that's a point that's true to us as well.
Yep, absolutely. And then, there's some other things in there as well, Joe. It's from an employer's perspective, employers under those areas around duty of care and grey fleets, lots of employers don't do anything around their grey fleets. Yeah, it's kind of, we don't own it, therefore we're not responsible for it. Yet they allow those vehicles to be used for business purposes. So last year in the UK, 98,000 licenses revoked because drivers had committed offences. 48,000 on top of the 98,000, a further 48,000 were taken away for medical reasons. Yeah. 80% of employers in the UK don't check to make sure that their employees have a legal right to drive. So they're not checking licenses, they're not checking insurance. Yeah. And employers should be taking action to ensure that their employees are safe and compliant. And under legislation here in the UK, Europe, as well as Australia, employers do have that duty of care for most employees. And recently in the EU, for many people, that then meant that that's from the time they leave home to the time they get back home again. So it's no longer just about the time they sat in the office. You're asking somebody to go and, go to a meeting on their way to work, then they are deemed to be at work from the time that they left their front door. So if they're doing that in their personal car, or a car that you've provided to them, or leased or rented, or you become liable.
The statistics around, you just mentioned, Paul, about, and it's something that, again, last week when we're talking in our own meeting, how often do these employers, validate that somebody has got a legitimate license or a current license, or is that they're driving to work in, or starting to do these tasks? Is it insured? It really made me sit back and think, what, we don't do it. It's just a simple thing that, I'll put my hand up and own up to this and say I haven't done that. And it's quite an alarming fact, again, to say the amount of people that are probably driving around for work, and most of us probably don't check licenses regularly, or wouldn't know if they've been disqualified. So it's a really valid point.
Yeah, absolutely, and it is quite a scary one. And the slide that's up there now, 31% of grey fleet drivers are involved in serious road traffic accidents. And there is under legislation at the moment, so under UK European law, and I would assume that under Australian law, because it's very close to kind of like UK law in many respects, it's important to ensure that people are capable of driving their vehicles, that they have a legal entitlement to do it, that they have adequate insurance in place. And it does vary from country to country. So I'm not sure of all the countries that we have online today, but for example, in the UK, I cannot insure an employee's car. The employee has to do it. So the onus sits on me to make sure that any of our employees, if they're using their personal vehicles, that their insurance is adequate and covers business use. In France, employers take out separate insurance on employees' private cars that allows them to use it not just for business use, but also for commuting. And and I know that in another part of Europe, in Slovenia, the employee has to go to a designated person in the company to pick up an insurance document that allows them to make the journey from their place of employment to the meeting, for example, and then back to their place of employment again. So the legislation does vary across different parts of Europe, but it covers, everybody. So we look at sales reps who are leaving their doors, care workers, plumbers, electricians. All of those people fall under legislation which is covered by road traffic laws, employment law, health and safety law, that makes employers liable when people are using those vehicles.
So one of the topics that I know we've talked about before, Paul, is and the risk best practice using these, the grey fleets. And I know in Australia we mentioned that we sometimes probably rarely even check the licenses or roadworthiness, or let alone insurance currency.
Yep.
But what are some of the best practices? And you talked about the, right down to someone having to go and, sign effectively almost like a trip insurance cover by the sound of what you're talking about. What are some of the examples you're seeing about the best practice on how companies are reducing the liability around this area?
So there are a number of areas, and I think one of the things that surprises me a little bit is that 80% of businesses do not have a written policy in place that covers travel of any description, let alone the use of grey fleet vehicles. And it's really important that companies put into place that policy, and that policy is adequate and covers all the different aspects that they need to take into account. So that's kind of the mode of transport, whether that's public transport, whether it's planes, trains, taxis, buses, and now we see coming into play a couple of other things as well, Joe. So there are things like What are people doing about ride shares? What are people doing about things like Uber? And I use that very loosely. So it's not just Uber, but all of the other similar type organisations that provide that kind of service. Yeah. And soon we'll see, obviously, autonomous vehicles and the way that that those are going to be used. So the policy needs to cover all forms of transport, and I would include in there things like cycling and walking as well. Yeah. If it's grey fleet,
so the 80% statistic is what you're seeing, that 80% don't have any reference to grey fleet in their policies at all. Is that right? 80%?
No, 80% of businesses do not have a policy in place.
Do not. Yes. Yep.
So they need to include their grey fleet into that policy. And I think one of the shocking things is, Joe, because grey fleet is dealt with not necessarily by logistics managers and fleet managers, it's often dealt with by HR people, and therefore the accounting processes on it are different. So nobody sees it as the big cost to the business that potentially it can be.
Which is something that we see quite often within our business, JESI. You know, like we come across businesses that, you know, employ thousands of people and maybe only have a couple of hundred cars or corporate fleet, you know, under that true definition. And we quite often, obviously, our position is talking about every single person that travels can use JESI. Now, that's the best practice of actually having a policy in place. I'll be interested to see when we do take some, you know, Q&A at the end, is to ask what sort of, you know, are there current templates? Are you seeing an uplift in your services being requested by these companies to come and deliver this? And maybe one a story I'd like you to share, Paul, is the example of the girl who was actually in the court of law asked to defend whether she had actually been given an induction on driving her own car. So I know it's a big question, but yeah, if you can talk to that.
Yeah, of course I can, Joe. I think one of the important things to remember is that because 80% of businesses don't have a policy in place, that, you know, it's really critical and key for them to get the policy in place as quickly as possible. And we are seeing slowly but surely an increasing demand of companies wanting to put a policy in place that covers not only their existing professional drivers, but also their grey fleet drivers. And that's a policy that covers all of their travel as well, irrelevant of the mode of transport. And I think in that policy, there are some key things that people need to make sure that they have in there. They need to make sure that there are driving license checks in there and that the employees agree to those driving license checks being made. They need to have something in there around insurance and making sure that the vehicles are insured for business use. They need to have something in there around maintenance and servicing records and ensuring that they can have access to those. So across those three major areas, driving licenses, insurance, maintenance and servicing, not only do they need to have the policy in place, they need to have a process in place that allows them to check those records on a regular basis. Now, the policy then obviously needs to dictate how often that's going to be, whether that's going to be monthly or quarterly or half yearly or yearly. The other things that they need to do is to have an induction process in place as new employees join the business, in the same way that you would if, for example, you ran an engineering company and somebody came to you who's got 20 years experience of operating a lathe. You will still have an induction process to make sure that they operate that lathe correctly and that all the safeguards are in place. And that's what you need to do when people come and they drive for you on business. Even if it's their own vehicle, you need to make sure that they have a driving license, that it's current and valid, that their insurance is in place, and that they can drive that vehicle safely because they're using it on company business. And just to kind of like explain to you how bad that can be, there was a court case last year where a young lady was in court. She'd been hit by a third party. And the solicitors, lawyers were very kind of like shrewd, and asked her at what point in time did her employer give her training to drive her vehicle. And the response was, I have a driving license. They went, no, that's not the question we asked. When did your employer give you training to drive your vehicle? Never. And that was the end of the case. And everything was found in favour of the employee, the third party, and it was all costed against the business.
Wow, it's actually bringing in a whole new level of, you know, competency around all sorts of skills, isn't it? So even having a license that may have been issued 20 years ago, to, in some way, what you're saying is we need to make sure that the competency is still there and that person's able to drive. And if it's going to come back as a discussion for the business, it's a pretty important point, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, there's in the UK last year, just an example, 48,000 people had their licenses revoked on medical grounds alone. And
wow,
you know, if they haven't declared that to the employers, then they could still be out there driving those vehicles today. And they could be driving anything. They could be driving a heavy goods vehicle. They could be driving a bus. They could be driving their own personal car.
Well, certainly, it's been a pretty intriguing topic, Paul. I know something that we've looked at and certainly talking to a lot of our clients about, and raising awareness around the potential risks and liabilities. So certainly, it's something that I'm sure that we'll get some questions around. So with that, we might actually start to take some of our Q&A from the audience listening. And certainly, we have one here from Renee. Will putting a grey fleet policy in place mean that I'll reduce any of my potential insurance claims?
Okay. On its own, it's unlikely that it would reduce your insurance premiums. What it can do, though, is very much defend you against potential claims that are made against you. It's a bit like having a health and safety policy. If you don't have one and somebody makes a claim against you, then obviously you're in difficulties. And it's the same thing, and it should be part of your health and safety process to have a grey fleet policy in place. So it will begin to strengthen your position against any claims that are made against you. So it should go to reducing your liabilities. But it needs to be backed up, as I said, you know, so it needs to have the, it's great having, we all have policies in place. How many of us enforce those policies? Yeah. And part of this is around making sure that those policies are enforced. And then there are some other things that you can do to strengthen that as well. And part of that is making sure that you send people on accredited defensive driver training courses.
Right. This one obviously has come from a good JESI supporter, as viewer 25. He's asking, hi Joe, how can JESI help with this problem? Probably an answer for you, Paul. You're one of our partners over there in the UK, so if you can maybe give us some understanding of how you JESI in this regard.
As a part of SAT's policy, we make sure that everybody who's driving on company business has been on a defensive driver training course. So me as the senior partner, right the way down to the guys at the bottom, everybody goes on one of those courses. That's then strengthened with obviously our written policy, and then we back that up by using JESI. And the way that we use JESI is essentially that every journey undertaken on business has to be put into JESI. If it's not in there, then a couple of things happen. One is we will raise queries with the employee about why they're not using it. And the second one is that we won't pay any expenses or claims against that journey. So if somebody submits a claim to us today to say, I've travelled from Manchester in the UK to Glasgow in the UK, and the journey was, I don't know, 220 miles at 45 pence a mile, and it's not in JESI, we don't pay for it. It's as simple as that. And we're thinking of currently extending that to all of our contractors as well. So we have quite a number of contractors, and we're thinking of extending that to them to say, look, if you're traveling for business on behalf of SAT, then you need to be using this system.
Okay, so really starting to, I guess, put the tool into place, which is great for us to see. Have you started using the travel risk assessment component yet, Paul?
We have, yes, in part. So we were using the old risk assessment that was in there, and now obviously the latest one has been released, so we've started using that, and we've also started using the travel itinerary import as well, which has been particularly useful because I fly quite a lot backwards and forwards to Europe, so I've been able to use it for that, and it's very effective, quite easy.
Very good, very good plug at the end for us, Paul. Very happy. Look, I think we're certainly probably getting to the end of our time, so we may actually wrap it up there. I'd certainly encourage listeners to reach out to either Paul or myself in regards to any questions you may have. The details are on the screen there, so it's CET for Paul, so CET at strategicanalyticsteam.com, and for the JESI team at customer solutions at jesims.com.au. So Paul, really appreciate your time. We're loving working with you and your team over in the UK, and then we look forward to doing a lot more. Certainly to all the listeners who have taken time out to dial in, whether it be the morning or the evening, or no matter where you find yourself in the world, we certainly thank you for your time. We want you to travel safe. Paul, thanks again.
My pleasure, Joe. Thank you very much.
Catching up again soon. Great. Okay, take care, and thank you.